Hey, Breaking Points, Marshall here. I'm with Derek Robertson of Politico. He wrote a funny but also important piece about how politicians are terrible podcasters. Now, Derek, I know that half of the audience is already rolling their eyes. This is superficial. This is vapid. Why is you listening to 10 hours of politician podcasts? Why is that important? There's bigger issues in the world. Why do you think, jokes aside, this is an important topic we should be thinking about?
Well, it evolved, the reason I wrote this and the reason it evolved from just a funny observation about how every politician seems to feel the need to, aspire to be the next Joe Rogan or something was because it is, communication is a part of being a politician. If politicians weren't communicators, they would be policy wonks, they would be lawyers, they would be any number of other things. It's an effective way. Politicians have historically used media to build followings, build support for their pet political causes. You think of FDR with radio. You think of, Reagan being the kind of president of the TV and pop culture era, and obviously Trump being literally a reality television star who became president. It is, the way politicians choose to communicate with the public is important. And it just so happens that what I found after, as you said, listening to 10 straight hours of podcasts hosted by politicians is that it is a medium that is uniquely unsuited to who they are and sort of what their duties are and the way they are allowed to function as public figures.
Yeah, the interesting kind of meta thing above all this is a lot of politicians are explicitly deciding that they no longer should engage with the press, with interviewers. There's nothing in it for them. Why should they give content to people who are trying to tear them down? So they see podcasting as a way to get direct with people, to talk to the audience they actually want to speak to without having to actually, let's say, get not even gotcha questions, but tough questions that you don't really want to hit. What do you think about that theory before we get into actual podcasting? Like, is it possible that politicians will be able to go around outside gatekeepers, whether they're left, right, or center?
It's funny. This is an element that I wanted to include in the piece that I wrote, but ended up not including just for reasons of, attempting to be concise for once. But there's a similar phenomenon to this happening in sports. I'm not sure if you're an NBA fan or for the viewers, Draymond Green and the Golden State Warriors he started his own podcast recently, and he's made a huge deal out of how players, NBA players and other athletes doing their own media is the quote new media as opposed to the old media, comprised of actual journalists. The idea that you can somehow get, closer to the truth or get a more kind of an experience of more veracity or authenticity by foregoing any kind of media interlocutor and just bringing people content yourself. And sometimes with Draymond Green's podcast, that's very entertaining because he's a really entertaining guy. Also, he's a pro athlete and is not beholden to the same kind of speech norms and incentives that politicians are. I think that with politicians sort of circumventing media and speaking directly to the faithful, as it were, through their own platforms, I think that, you can be very successful in building a niche audience with that. Ted Cruz's podcast, as I write about, is actually very popular. It's consistently in sort of the top 40, 50 on the podcast charts, if I'm remembering correctly. But the vast majority of people are not going to, I think that the idea that you can build an entire media platform and be an effective politician based solely on your own sort of media stream is kind of a myopic one. And it's kind of one that hems you into playing to the base. Of course, there's any number of arguments that could be made that that is the most effective political strategy to take in the era we live in. But I don't think that, I'm very skeptical that that will be a totally viable media strategy, because at some point, depending on how large your ambitions are, you need to reach people outside of your little echo chamber, and you can't really do that without interlocutors, without someone to kind of vouch for you, give you credibility with a different audience than who you're used to.
Yeah, and it's funny. I'm glad you brought up Draymond Green because that gets to the core of the actual challenge here. I think on one level, politicians aren't your friend, and you write about this, but the podcasting medium, someone's in your ear, you're watching them, it feels really direct, it feels different. And if Draymond Green wants to interact with a very specific way, like that's different than a politician who has objectives, who's trying to win. I hope that listeners and audiences can understand that it's slightly cynical to think that we could just go around things. Because look, we get it. We've all seen a bad faith media interview. Maybe some of us have given bad faith media interviews before, if I'm entirely honest with myself. But at the same time, like, you should remember that what a politician is saying when they say, let's just go around all the gatekeepers, is they're basically saying, I want to be able to say my talking points that me and my staff wrote to you without anyone asking for a follow-up question. That's what's actually being said here. So here's my question for you then. What was the experience like actually listening to these shows? Like, what shows were the best shows? Which formats weren't particularly effective? Was there any difference between like whether Republicans or Democrats were good at the medium? Like, what did you find?
So there are two main points I want to make here. One of them is that I was very sort of pleasantly surprised by how, and again, maybe this was just by contrast, or maybe I was experiencing Stockholm syndrome. Dan Crenshaw's podcast was pretty enjoyable. It's really just kind of a chatty, it doesn't really have a strong structure. It feels the most like a normal podcast. He will just, some of them are, it's an interview format. This kind of ties into the other point I was trying to make. It is an interview format in that he is the host and he brings on various guests, but frequently these guests are simply friends of his, like Representative Mike Gallagher. And it's really just two kind of like nerdy Gen X politician guys chatting about like which Batman is the best for 10 minutes or something. It approximates the most closely of any of these that I listen to what the normal experience of listening to a podcast is like. So the second point is that most politicians fall on kind of a stock podcast format that is the interview show. So many of these that I listen to are basically just politicians attempting to be like, do the Ezra Klein show, basically, and just do kind of a long searching interview with one subject. And this does something that I goes hand in hand with what you are describing, which is the fact that when you're doing the kind of new media bit, you have a captive audience and you have total control of the medium and the message that you are creating. By being the interviewer instead of the interviewee, it effectively allows politicians not only to not have to answer questions they don't want to answer, they set the terms of the conversation and they kind of take the reflected, you curate the guests to reflect your own, this is what I'm interested in. This is who I want to platform. This is who I am allied with. And it ends up being incredibly boring because most politicians are not good interviewers. Good interviewing requires a level of confrontationalism. It requires a level of kind of willingness to prick under the superficial sort of surface of what it is that you are nominally talking about. And most politicians do not want to do that because they do not want to create friction, because the podcast is essentially a vanity platform for their political project. A good example of this was, I hate to say it because he is, as I write in the piece, a great broadcaster, literally a Grammy-winning broadcaster for reading his audiobooks. But Al Franken's podcast could be a tough listen at times because he's plotting a political comeback. That there are questions he wants to ask people that are sort of just bubbling up under the surface. Al Franken is a guy with an active wit and active intelligence. And you can tell that there are things that are just off limits that he does not want to talk to people about. So it makes for a very dull, the interview format just makes for an incredibly dull program. Pete Buttigieg was guilty of this too. His podcast was just astonishingly dull in that way.
You reference this, but whatever happened with President Obama's podcast?
Renegades, yes, with Bruce Springsteen. I wrestled over whether to include this in the article, and I ended up not including it because it's such a strange. I was saying that these are vanity projects, but that's a vanity project. It's really, presumably, I don't know what the numbers were. Spotify thought this was going to be a blockbuster podcast. It's Obama and Bruce. For viewers who don't know, Obama did a podcast with Bruce Springsteen where they had kind of these like sort of freewheeling conversations about various topics like masculinity, race, politics, etc. It's actually pretty entertaining. I listened to a few episodes of it. It's not bad, but it's one of those things where you listen to it and you just go, I don't know who this is for. It doesn't, Obama being the measured guy that he is, it doesn't have the kind of like crackle and pop that like really good conversational podcasts that talk about various controversial political issues do. Springsteen is good. Anyone who's ever seen like live footage of a Springsteen concert, he's a master storyteller, and it's just fun to listen to him talk. And he's to use a cliche, he could read the phone book and it would be entertaining. But this show got they stopped making episodes of it. I think it was part of the Obama's people will likely remember that Michelle Obama also had a big podcast deal with Spotify. I wrestled with whether to include this because I think the Obamas deciding to basically become media influencers post-presidency is worthy of its own examination, and that it didn't really tie into my premise of examining how sitting politicians use this as a platform to further their ambitions and their political projects. But the Obamas podcasts are done.
So the last two questions here. Question one would be, you noted there's actually there are far more like Republican podcasts than Democratic podcasts, and the Republican ones tend to do better. I'm curious like what your theory of the case for why that would be true is.
I think there are a couple of things going on there. I think there's just more of an appetite for them. This predates podcasting. You have the dominance of Republicans and conservatives on talk radio for many, many decades. It seemed like someone would write an article every 2 years going, why can't the left? Why isn't there a popular left broadcasting personality or service? And there was Air America, if viewers will remember, which was the attempt during the Bush era to compete with right-wing talk radio, and which featured Al Franken, coincidentally, before he became a senator. I think that there is right-wing rhetoric lends itself much more easily to creating the kind of closed epistemological garden that makes for good agitprop. If you are having a podcast where I'm trying to imagine, the popular left podcasts tend to be ones that are really angry and that kind of mimic the tone of right-wing radio and rile people up, tell them, I know this is what you want to hear. None of those bastards want me to say it to you, but I'm going to say it anyway. And like, we're going to have our moment of catharsis together. You think about the popular media approaches that left-wing politicians have had in that vein have been like, on one level you have Chapo Trap House, which is like a total DIY thing, and then you have like Michael Moore, who's a populist documentarian who largely in a different medium sort of does the same thing rhetorically that right-wing talk hosts are doing. So I think that the right-wing mode of rhetoric just lends itself better to the format. Second is, this is actually just part of the same point, but there's a huge legacy audience built in. A lot of the popular podcasts, political podcasts now, are from old school right-wing radio guys like Mark Levin, people like that. So you just have a lot of holdover from people who are loyal radio listeners and now are doing the podcast routine.
So the last question would be, look, we can say that politicians are bad at podcasting all we want. They're going to do it anyways. It's a new format. That's the reality. What would be your advice if you were a comms director for a Democrat or Republican? What would be your advice for like, how do we make this as much of a win as possible relative to your point, the weaknesses that a politician is always going to have in the format?
My advice would be to hire an incredibly good editor. My advice would be to, I don't care if you have to do it in a skiff or if you have to like make sure the tape self-destructs. Put your candidate or your office holder, whoever you work for, in a room with someone they actually want to talk to, that they personally think is interesting, whether it's, a policy person, a lawyer, like someone, a dietitian, like literally anyone who they authentically think is interesting. Put them in a room, have them just candidly speak to each other tell the politician, like, you can swear, you can say shit about your constituents that like you wouldn't want anyone to hear ever. Like, you can say anything and we will edit it to remove all instances of anything that you cannot say on the record by virtue of being a politician. Now, this is the reason I am not a comms director, because no professional comms director would ever allow or tell a politician to do this. But I think it is the only way to actually get to the authenticity of the medium that makes people like it so much. I would also tell them to have a co-host. So
Ted Cruz does this.
Exactly. Yeah. The thing about Cruz's podcast is like almost there. Like Cruz has Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire, and they have a little bit of a rapport where, you know, Knowles will wind him up about something in the conservative media cycle, and then Ted Cruz will deliver one of his Ted Cruz speeches, and they come close to having an okay rapport. But you need. I think there are limitations unless the people involved are very, very close friends to having just a two-man room. I think if I were playing fantasy comms director here, I would say get one of your best friends on the Hill. It doesn't have to be another office holder, although cool if it is. Get one of them to commit to hosting the show with you and do what I just said. And the two of you will just have kind of like a free-floating conversation with a person you think is interesting, and we will edit it to pieces to make sure that you don't, end up on my website, Politico.com tomorrow saying something that you shouldn't have.
Well, you heard it here. Any Hill staffers or future or current politicians who are listening, Derek, thank you so much for joining us on Breaking Points.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall. Had a great time as always.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.